Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Transgender Show. I'm your host, Emily. I hope you're having a wonderful night out there in this beautiful Pride Month. I don't know how the weather is out there for you. Here in Southern California, it's absolutely gorgeous. So it's the perfect month for us to celebrate and be out and in public, celebrating our pride for our identities. Tonight's show, it features Junia Joplin. Junia is a pastor in Ontario, Canada. She was fired from a Baptist church for coming out as transgender and filed a lawsuit for wrongful dismissal. She describes herself as a so-so runner, a banjo player, poetry lover, maker of good trouble, and most importantly, a hockey mom. Everybody, welcome to the show, Junia.
Hey there. Thanks for having me,
Hello.
Emily. Great to be here.
It's wonderful to have you on. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to adjust your camera just slightly. Let's see. That should have been it. Nope. There we go. You're just a little bit off center there, so we're getting you in the middle.
Like me or my?
Yeah, you sit where you're gonna sit. What's best for you, and then I will center you accordingly.
Okay.
There we go. Okay.
All right.
Let's see. I thought I had it. Maybe you moved a little bit, so we're good.
I probably did. I'm antsy.
So the way that the show format works is we ask several questions about your gender journey, and then we'll take a break and we'll come back and talk about things outside of that. This is one of the cases where there's a lot of overlap, but we'll try and keep them pretty well divided. Everybody, you can ask your questions throughout the show, and we will get to them after that break. And let's go ahead and dive in. First off, I like to start with my favorite question. How did you choose your name?
Oh, I love that question. Junia is the name of a female apostle in the Christian scriptures, the New Testament. In the book of Romans, which is about the sixth book in the New Testament, near the end of the book, I can never remember whether it's chapter 16 or 17, somewhere like that. St. Paul, who was writing to a community he had never visited before, but where he knew a lot of people, just starts saying, say hello to Andronicus, say hello to Titus for me, say hello to Mary for me. And it's just this long list of names. And one of those names is Junia, which is a feminine name in like ancient Greek Latin. And he mentions Junia and says that she is outstanding among the apostles. So that's really cool. And most people don't know about Junia because for like thousands of years, 1500 years, more than that, up until like almost the 18th or 19th century, translators saw that name next to the phrase outstanding apostle and said, well, that can't be right. There can't possibly have been a woman as an apostle. And so they changed it. They masculinized the name into something that didn't exist in antiquity. They named her Junius. It would be like, I don't know, taking any English name that is a feminine name like Sylvia and saying, no, that can't be right. It must have been Silvio, which is actually a man's name that exists. But Junius is not a man's name that exists in antiquity, but there's lots of Junias. And so Junia is a leader in the history of the church who's kind of literally had to assert her femininity across the ages. And, I think of her as kind of a patron saint for those of us who've had to assert our gender in spite of what people tell us we are. And, it abbreviates to June, which is great. And sometimes people call me Junie, and I love it.
That's awesome. As a pastor, how important was it for you to choose a name out of the Bible?
Well, it wasn't the most important thing. Mostly, I just kind of wanted to keep my initials because my son and I share initials, and I didn't want that to change. And so, I have this giant family. My parents are children of families of 12 kids and 6 kids. And so I don't know how many first cousins I have. It's like 24 or something. And so every woman's J name between my aunts and my cousins and in-laws is kind of taken. So I had to dive a little deeper. I guess I was considering like Judith and maybe it would have gone by Judy, but decided to go with Junia because I like June, and you know how it is when you start trying out a new name.
Mm-hmm.
When your peers are like, oh, that's you. That's the one. You just kind of like, well, okay, I guess that's the one then. So from the moment I picked it, everybody really affirmed it. And so June.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's great when everybody else takes to it quickly like that, and they're like, "Yeah, that fits you." I sort of had that with mine, where I chose it, and then I wasn't sure. I was like, "I'm not sure that this fits," and they're like, "Oh yeah, it does." I'm like, "Cool,
Yeah.
all right, moving on then." So, when did you first realize that you were transgender, and then that was the term that fit with you?
Yeah. Okay. But now the second part of that question is key there. And I would say I was 39 years old, so it was 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I grew up in a very conservative environment, fundamentalist Christianity, small conservative town in the American South, and the idea that you could be something other than what you were assigned at birth was just, inconceivable. And so, right up until I was 39, I never really had um, the concept of being transgender explained to me. And sometimes I just avoided learning, I guess.
Yeah, we find ourselves kind of covering in a lot of denial and
Yeah.
trying diversion. So, what were the things that now that you at 39 you've come to this realization and you're able to look back and trace it back? What were some of the things that should have led you there earlier?
Well, from probably 5 or 6 years old,
Mm,
I consciously would just dream of being a girl. Um, it, in that way that we sort of form these thoughts and scenarios when we're very young that really don't make sense and are
mhm,
almost like silly and embarrassing looking back. I think, a common scenario I would imagine when I was a kid would be that at some point someone would come or some group of people would come to where I lived and take me away to something like a learn to be a girl boot camp and like a finishing school almost. And that's where I would learn all the stuff I needed to know. And effectively, that would be like the transition center. And, that was something I thought a lot about. By the time I was a teenager, I was trying on my mom's dresses every chance I got when I was home alone or had some time in secret. Um, I can remember, and it's interesting because he can be kind of a controversial figure within the queer community, but I can remember very clearly when RuPaul was like the supermodel featured in MAC Cosmetics ad campaign in like 1994, and I can remember seeing him in what was like a red patent like pleather bustier and thigh high boots and a blonde wig, and just thinking this is someone who was assigned male at birth and is really, really looks good and is really celebrating femininity in a way that doesn't show any shame, in a way that doesn't suggest he's some kind of pervert, in the way that is just really bold and empowered, and that just kind of blew my mind.
mhm.
And and so there were times when, not knowing that transition was a thing, I would think, gosh, maybe I could be a drag queen, except I'm not really gay. Just anything I could conceive of that could get me into feminine gender expression.
Mhm.
And I did my best to kind of shut that stuff out of my mind. When I was in college, when I was at university, it was the late '90s. I graduated in 2001,
Mhm.
and so spent a lot of time in AOL chat rooms, and I met somebody who was also a college student out closer to where you live, and we talked a lot. And she was maybe the first person I ever opened up to about how much I wish I was a girl. And
Mm.
she actually gave me the name Alexandria, which for a while, until I picked the name June, like from the time I became self-accepting until I said, I need to pick a forever name, I went by Alexandria or Zan. And, um, in those days, it was just, isn't this weird? It was almost like she saw it and I saw it as this kink, almost to be ashamed of. And,
Yeah.
I sometimes I wonder how my life would have been different if anybody had known well enough back then, or if she'd known, or anybody I'd met had known well enough to say, honey, like, cisgender people don't talk like this.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you should talk to a gender therapist but I mean, Western North Carolina, 1999, 2000, it would have been hard to transition.
Mm-hmm.
I went through life with this kind of unclassifiable depression that didn't make any sense because like the details of my life were pretty good. And I used to just call it like the shadows or the darkness. And I'd say, it's there again. And I thought maybe it was related to my career. And so, I took this amazing job at this really great church in Canada, moved my family to this really incredible new place in Toronto. And, within a year, it was just like, well, it's back again. And so like the thing that, I'm not personally a fan of like the language of like egg cracking. It's just personal preference, I guess. It sounds like so indelicate, but I guess it's not really a delicate process. But I guess you could say my egg cracked when I was the manager of my oldest son's hockey team, and I had to do this like gender and gender identity awareness training as the result of a lawsuit that the Ontario Hockey Federation had lost when a coach had made a trans boy change in the girls' room. And so he sued and he won. His name was Jesse Thompson. I owe him a lot. And he lives on the other side of Toronto from me. And he won the suit. And so the Ontario Hockey Federation said, okay, you coaches have got to learn about this stuff so you don't do this again. And so I was a manager, not an on-ice coach, but a manager. And I took this seminar, and by the end of it, I said, you know what? I think this trans thing, I think that's me. And by the end of that season, I had self-accepted. So hockey means a lot to me for a lot of reasons.
That's so interesting and beautiful. And that period, you've already got so much kind of locked in, some of those things that, a lot of trans people make a lot of trans people really fearful of coming out. Did you feel or do you feel now, like looking back, did you push yourself in ways, pushing yourself into things like getting married or, the career you chose, doing sports things? Was any of that pushed by the attempt to, keep that transgender side of you at bay?
For sure. What I generally tell people is I've never been a man and I didn't know how to be a man, but the man of God thing, like there was a pretty good roadmap for that. Like if you're a pastor, it's very different from being, a bus driver or a bank teller or an accountant or even a lawyer. Like it's your entire identity, It's funny, like when I was in seminary, I took a class called Life and Work of the Pastor. And part of one of the lectures was about, okay, here's how you present yourself in public. Here's what kind of car you can drive, and don't go too extravagant, but don't go too cheap either. And I mean, it was none of it was like, you have to do this. It was just, the class was taught by a retired pastor who had been very successful and was a mentor of mine. And he said, these are things that I learned. And, he talked about when he started the job, his first job at a big church. It was like the 1960s, and he'd mow his grass wearing shorts, and his church was scandalized because his predecessor had literally mowed his grass in like a dress shirt and a necktie. And, it's the kind of job where people care about what you wear when you mow your grass, or how your kids look, or what's going on between you and your spouse. And so it really is, more and I should say, not every church is like that, and it's increasingly not like that, but it is the kind of career that gives you a ready-made identity. And so I dedicated a lot of my time and a lot of my energy to that man of God archetype, and I was pretty good at it.
First off, I want to address the way I phrased that question. I really hated it coming out of my mouth. The transgender side of you, that felt very, very wrong. So I apologize for that for anybody who might have been given kind of a slant look at that one. I'm losing my words here, but anyways, it's like I said, it is something that we kind of, that a lot of the people I've interviewed have tended towards, those things that push you away from that side and kind of keep you down this path. And it's interesting that you chose something that had such a laid out path for you that you sort of don't have to think about it. You just follow the rules and follow the lines. Okay, this is what I do next.
Yeah.
You're, were you already, yeah, you were a pastor at this point when you came to this
That's
realization, right?
I started working, I got my first church job actually about the same time that my friend online was naming me Alexandria.
Mm.
So I was about 19 or 20 and got a youth ministry job at a little church in my hometown. And so it's been like 23 years, more than half my life now. And like I said, I did pretty well. I felt good about the first church I pastored, where I was there about 7 years. I had been invited to be part of like denominational leadership. I felt, in some ways, I felt like I had a bright future, so to speak. And the fact that this pretty good sized church, pretty healthy church in a really great place was interested in calling me to be their pastor was another indication of that. And that's certainly, and so that's where I was. And that really complicated the whole process of coming out for me quite a bit. In fact, the span of time between when I became self-accepting and when I fully came out was more than 2 years.
I think that's, I think that can also be pretty standard. I think for me, it was even longer than that because of my fear of each step. And I didn't even have a career like yours that was on, in a lot of ways on the surface against sort of everything that you are. So how did you navigate that at the time? You've got family, you've got a spouse, you've got kids, and you have this career. Where did you start in your coming out process?
Well, on the day I became self-accepting, I got in my car, drove to the gay village in Toronto, where there is like the oldest queer bookstore in North America. And these are all just things I Googled, and I walked in looking very different than this, and like I was crying. It must have been at least a little awkward for the clerk I talked to, but I said to this clerk, like, I've got questions about my gender identity. I don't know what to do. Can you recommend something that I could read? And so I bought Janet Mock's book, Redefining Realness. That's what they suggested. And then they also said, there's a community center a couple blocks up the street. And if you go in there, you can talk to somebody about getting connected with a therapist. And so I did that. I went to the 519 Community Center in Toronto, and that it was a Friday the 13th. It was Friday, April the 13th, 2018. And that evening, I came out to my then wife because I was so obviously shaken that she kept asking me, well, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? And so I told her, and her reaction was pretty good. It was surprised. It was anxious, but it was also one of love and support. And from then on, I just said, okay, I'm gonna do what I can do. So, within a couple of weeks, I had ordered a dress off Amazon, and I was just kind of practicing feminine presentation, makeup, all those things that at the time and still kind of do matter a lot to me. And by June of 2018, I had started kind of going out in the world presenting female every now and then. That was, I just kept putting one foot in front of the other. I went to, so my doctor at the time was someone connected to my church. And so I knew it would probably be, good doctors keep things confidential, but, I was still anxious about coming out to my doctor. And so I switched doctors, which in Toronto can take a while. And so I started looking for a doctor around December 2018, January 2019, and finally, that process was long. Even though this is an informed consent province, I didn't start estrogen until August of 2019, so it took a long time to find somebody.
So you started before you were out completely. You started kind of dipping your toe, and you were going out in feminine presentation. And you'd already mentioned that all eyes are on you in the community, and you've got a very certain they have very certain expectations for you. How much extra pressure do you feel like that added?
The great thing about if I had been living in my hometown, which is like 3,000 people, even if I'd been living in Richmond, Virginia, which is where I moved from, which is maybe like 1 million people, but like 100 or 2,000 right in the city proper, I don't think I could have done what I was doing. Like most pastors, because we work on Sundays, we take a weekday off. And so Monday was my day off. And Monday was the day that when my wife was at work, when my kid was at school, it was time to, go out into the city and run errands or meet friends or just do things as June. And it was a lot of, I got a lot of good practice. And the great thing about being in a city of 7 million people and serving in a church that's kind of out in the suburbs where not many people go into the city except for just like a particular core downtown, is you can kind of be anonymous. And as long as I went to a different section of Toronto, I never ran into anybody I knew except maybe once, and they didn't really see me. And so that's one of the benefits of being someplace like this. Yeah.
Do you find that your makeup of friends and the people that you associate with the most are predominantly new folks that you met as June, or do you still retain a lot of the people from before? I find that it's typically easier to talk to people that just know me as Emily versus the tension of the old folks who knew me before.
Well, it's interesting because as a newcomer to Canada, as an immigrant, as somebody who moved specifically for this particular church job, that community was kind of my community. I hadn't made very many friends at all who weren't somehow connected to my church, whether it was other people who went to the church or colleagues in ministry in other parts of the city. Like I just didn't have many friends. Had a great community, but it was all kind of insular. And because of the things that happened after I came out, it's mostly, I don't see those folks much. There are a few that I do, and then I've got a lot of old friends who are really supportive in the United States. Mostly a lot of ministry colleagues who are very progressive, folks I went to seminary with, folks I got to know in my years of studying and working in the States. And, for a number of reasons, COVID or just, not having the time or the money, like I haven't gotten to see many of those people except electronically. I'm registering for my first conference in the States in September. So for the first time since I transitioned, I'm going to be down at it's actually a preaching conference for women in Austin, Texas. And I'm super excited about that because I'm going to see people that I haven't seen since I transitioned, and it's people who are really excited for me. But yeah, I have found that most of my closest friends here in Toronto, pretty much everybody, it's people that I've met since I've transitioned. And it's kind of cool, I was talking to one of my friends a month or two ago, and we're both single, we're both separated, and we're talking about weddings and about whether or not we would ever get married again. And I said, well, yeah, I would absolutely get married again just for the chance to do it in a dress. And she was like, what did you wear the first time? And I was like, well, I was in a tuxedo. And she was like, oh yeah, I forgot. And so that's kind of nice, those types of interactions with friends who just cannot conceive of you any other way, those are pretty special.
Yeah. It's very euphoric, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So, with all of those different areas that had a lot of tie to who you were previously and a lot invested in that, who was the most difficult person for you to come out to, or the hardest group?
Well, I don't know. Like in a way, it was my congregation,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because they were the ones that they were the last. I essentially came out to the world and my congregation at the same time in real time,
Mm-hmm.
and but my parents were tough, and I came out to my siblings in the summer of 2019, and they handled things pretty well. Um, Sometimes things are a little strange with them. And I think they're still adjusting. And I think it's been difficult because there's so much distance between us because we can't visit because of COVID. But, I wouldn't say they're not supportive. And in fact, they love me a lot. And I think in time, it'll feel okay. But after I told them, one of the first things that like my sister said was like, you can't tell mom and dad yet. They were terrified of me coming out to mom and dad. And so, you know, mom and dad both reacted pretty badly.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really proud of how far my mom has come. And I think the thing that did it for her was just realizing like seeing some of the consequences that she is facing because she has come out. There's no way that she would have just woke up one morning and said, I think I'm going to pretend to be a girl. Like this is very obviously who she is. And so my mom's been really great. My dad tries,
Mm-hmm.
and he is so he's a kind man. In a lot of ways, he's a loving man. He's like a lot of 67-year-old men, kind of stubborn, kind of set in his ways, and he's very dedicated to his brand of Christianity that doesn't make room for folks like me or folks like his sister who's married to a woman. And I think he tries to love us as best he can, but trips on one hurdle or another. And
Hmm.
so, my dad and I don't talk much, but I pray for my dad. Even when I don't really believe in prayer, which is sometimes I'm not really sure I believe in prayer, and I pray for my dad. I I prayed for my dad this morning, went into the chapel at my church and just said, God, if you're out there, if you're listening, it'd be really cool if my dad accepted me and acknowledged me for who I am one day. And I hope that happens. But I love him and he loves me either way, I think. So they were probably the hardest.
Mm-hmm. Through those difficult conversations that you had with your congregation, with your family, with your spouse, what is some of the advice that you have for that particular, what were some of the things that you feel that you did that were most successful? And are there any things that you feel are kind of pitfalls or traps to avoid?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I would say a pitfall and something to really consider, if you're the type of person who has even a little bit of a public platform, and I had a kind of a small, maybe like community wide public platform when I came out, and all of a sudden it just exploded. And before you knew it, I was like doing television interviews and talking to the New York Times and, getting a lot of attention. I think about that, I was fortunate enough to have made friends with a few trans women whose coming out attracted media attention. And they talked to me about what that would be like. I had one trans woman friend who said, based on what you do for a living, based on the fact that you're white, based on like how you look, you're kind of pretty, which I thought was nice of her to say. But you should be prepared to be on the Canadian version of Good Morning America. And I said, you are out of your mind. And she was right. And so like I was thinking about that in advance. I deliberately chose that visibility And what I recognize looking back is that maybe I prioritized visibility at the expense of like my mental health. And so I'm not as interested in visibility these days. I try not to say no when people reach out to me, but I'm not in the news anymore, so people don't reach out to me very much. And so like and I'm not a senior pastor at the church I work in. I'm the associate pastor. I can be in the background a little bit. And if I ever choose to try to step up onto the platform again, maybe I'll do that, but maybe I won't, because thankfully there are a lot of really good trans folks with platforms, including some really incredible faith leaders out there, that if somebody like me says, you know what, I don't have the spoons to step in front of the camera or to like speak up or be this public figure, that they do. So that's one piece of advice. Gosh. I guess that would be the main one. I had another one, but I can't remember what it was. Goodness. I started out with my head, and one of them just flew right out of my head.
That's fine. Talking about, coming out to the congregation and all that. I mean, that's it's sort of interesting because I'm in a little bit of that, trying to help trans people get stories out to people. So, there's a lot of a public aspect to what I do as well. For good and bad, I haven't hit the level of publicity that you have. So I haven't really faced a lot of that, but it's really kind of interesting to hear you say that, when you're doing so much publicly and putting yourself out there, you're focused on a persona, right? And you're focused on again, that same thing that you have in the field of being a pastor, of the appearance and the right way of doing things. Whereas, if you're just focusing on you and keeping it internal and figuring out what's best for you, I think you choose a slightly different path.
Abigail Thorne, Philosophy Tube on YouTube, came out a little after I did. And I didn't know it, but she and I were in a Slack server together, and she was just this person named Abby, and we didn't know it was Philosophy Tube. Maybe the moderators did, and she would post about her anxiety around coming out and how she was probably going to get a lot of attention. And we didn't know she was like one of the biggest YouTube creators out there. And one of the things she said in her coming out video, which is just masterfully put together, was how knowing that she would instantly become one of the highest profile trans women in the UK, which is a tough place to be trans. One of the most famous trans women on what she called Turf Island, and a lot of people call Turf Island. She felt a lot of pressure to do it, to be good at it. And that really resonated with me. I'm coming from a much, much smaller platform, but just, I did recognize that if I, this is who I am. And so I don't think anything that you see in me is me putting on or, affecting a persona. But I did recognize that, being kind of stereotypically and traditionally feminine, just kind of passing for a suburban mom, being white, being Christian, being all these things that like people in the West are pretty okay with, that I could be one of the quote unquote good ones, and in fact, I've talked to transphobic people who would say like, I don't have any problem with you. And so I recognize that there might be people who would hear me and listen to me, and just try to use that privilege the best way I could. I don't know. I have mixed feelings about that all the time, but especially now because playing, it's not like I'm playing a game because, again, this is really who I am. But kind of buying into that respectability politics kind of thing, it doesn't, at the end of the day, it doesn't win us anything. There's not anybody that's trying to ban transition-related care for trans kids who's going to look at somebody like me and say, oh, yeah, okay. you're doing this well enough that I'm going to change my mind, you know. But I do think, well, for example, my church, 53 of those folks voted to keep me as their pastor, and that is unfortunately the side story. But if you think about what you know about Baptist churches, a Baptist church with about 110 voting members, about half of them said, you know what, we will keep this trans woman as our pastor. That's kind of remarkable. And I think part of it was because, one, they knew me, and because, two, like, I made sense as a woman to them.
Hmm.
So I don't know if always try to keep your privilege in mind. Um, I've heard so many people say you can transition and live as a woman, but you can't get rid of your whiteness. That's one thing that we still keep, and or you can't. You're not going to change like your class. You're not going to change. There's a lot of things that you're not necessarily going to change that endow you with privilege. And if you're going to use it well. And I hope I have. I know I haven't always, but one thing that I try to do is keep keep make friends with people who kind of make you uncomfortable. Whether it's because their political views are a little more radical than yours, or because their gender presentation is very different than yours, or because their understanding of gender is very different than yours. I was talking to a really dear friend about an article I was writing the other day, and they just, they were bringing up things about, abolishing borders and stuff like that were far enough out that I was like, yeah, you know what, you're right, but I don't think like you do, and we need that. And so, as trans people, I think we're part of a community that welcomes, I hope, and celebrates diversity, unlike just the society at large. And so, listen to people who are different than you, even within that community, even under the umbrella.
Well, that's one of our key frustrations here at the Transverse is the kind of segregation, the gatekeeping, and the different things that happen even within the trans community. We've seen it within the LGBT community with the LGBT Alliance and things like this, but we even see it drilled down as far as the trans community. And so, it's very important to not do that, to not gatekeep, to let as many people in as possible. And you learn from them, they learn from you. You keep mentioning that the church you're with currently, I know there's not a lot you can say about the church that you were let go from because of the pending litigation, but how did you find another place to be welcomed and then actually get hired there?
I kind of can't believe it. I came out in a sermon 2 years ago next week, a week from today, June 14th, is my second fully out anniversary, whatever you want to call that.
Came out in June, of course. How apropos.
Yeah. Well, that was the plan all along. Didn't really have that much to do with Pride Month. That if you're a pastor, you kind of understand like the rhythm of your church's schedule. And I was like, okay, that's a month. I think it would be okay. Again, trying to be nice about it as much as I could. I'm not going to come out like during Advent. I'm not going to come out during Lent leading up to Easter. And let's there's not much going on in June. Yeah, I'll tell people I'm trans then. And mainly we were having this big celebration of our 100th anniversary. If it weren't for that, and if it weren't for COVID, I might have come out in like 2019, 2018, who knows? Anyway, to your question, I am now working as an associate pastor at the Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto. And my first connection with MCC Toronto was shortly after I became self-accepting. And in that first couple of months when I was presenting as June some of the time, but not really comfortably and not really often. And, as a person of faith, I wanted a place that I could go and belong. And not be the pastor and not just be a woman in the pew, and so I knew that this queer-friendly church had a Sunday night service, and that I wasn't doing anything on Sunday nights most of the time, some of the time. And so I would go out there on Sunday nights. And in fact, the first time I went, I was presenting, male, and kind of looked around the sanctuary, and I heard the sermon in which the pastor who's now become my friend, Dina Dudley, brilliant preacher, preached a sermon about courage, and she explicitly mentioned how she admired the courage of trans people. And I just said, gosh, I can be myself here. And so when I came back, I was as myself, and I've never done it differently. The clergy at MCC Toronto were some of the first people that I opened up to about my full identity. Most of the people who knew me as June just knew me as some woman, and they knew I had a job in the suburbs, but they didn't know what it was. And they were some of the first people I said, I'm trans, I'm not out yet. I'm the pastor of this Baptist church in the suburbs, and I'm afraid of what's going to happen when I come out. And so they became and continue to be. Jeff Brock and Dina Dudley, the two other clergy there, are just, they've meant the world to me. Dina gave me, can't reach it from here, but yesterday Dina gave me the Laverne Cox Barbie doll. And I love it. First Barbie doll I've ever owned. It's perfect. But I came out, like I said, June 14th, 2020, in a sermon. And, I thought, what, this could be the last sermon you ever preach. So, be ready for that. And it was the last sermon I ever got to preach for my old church, Lauren Park Baptist. But people started calling me. We're in the middle of the pandemic. Nobody's having church in person. Church is always happening by a live stream or Zoom, YouTube, whatever. And so I got fired on like July 26th, and I think it was a Monday. And by July, I think 30th or whatever, maybe it was July 20th, whatever it was, by the following Sunday, I had a sermon lined up at another church. And the next Sunday, it was in New Orleans. My dear friend, Reverend Elizabeth Watts Church, St. Charles Avenue Baptist Church in New Orleans. And the next week I was preaching for, I think it was First Baptist Rochester, a friend of mine who was really supportive of me. And the next week, 2 churches wanted me to preach. So I had to record and send in a sermon and do one live. And I look back, I kept a list of all the churches all over the world that reached out to me and said, hey, we want you to preach here. And I was out of work for about 30 Sundays, and I preached in like 42 churches. So it was more than one a week. And in most of those churches, in the vast majority of those churches, there had never been a trans woman in the pulpit delivering a sermon. And so I felt like that visibility was important. And during this time, when I was unemployed, and I was making a little bit of money from preaching, not much, and I started. My friend started a GoFundMe, and it sort of helped me pay my bills during this time. But the pastor at MCC Toronto, Jeff, I mentioned him just a moment ago, said, I've got this job, and I think you'd be good at it, and you should apply. And so I did. And they offered it to me, I think, in January of 2021. I started in March of 2021. And I feel really lucky. It's a great church. It's, the whole Metropolitan Community Church movement is remarkable. It was started about, more than 50 years ago by a gay man who had been a Baptist and Pentecostal preacher in the South. And he said, there needs to be some kind of faith community for queer people. And so he ran an ad, and it was in Los Angeles. I don't remember the name of the magazine, but, essentially a gay magazine. And about a dozen people showed up at his house. And now there are metropolitan community churches all over the world. And it's a really moving experience, whether you're a person of faith or not, I think, but especially if you're a person of faith, because people show up on Sunday mornings, whether it's their first time or they've been going for 30 years. And, these are people that have been told by other churches, you can't stay here. Or you can, but we think you're sinful. We think you're broken, an abomination. And so it's a bunch of us like cast-offs. And, it's just, I cry every Sunday, literally cry every Sunday. And it's a beautiful thing. Just the fact that we found this place.
That's
It's a great place to work.
that's so powerful, and I'm so glad that you were able to find that. Since COVID stuff had, people have started to kind of open up again. Have you done any of that pastoring in, done any sermons in pastoring? Have you done any sermons in other churches? Have you been able to travel and do any of that?
Now, yeah, a few. I made this big trip back to the States last November over American Thanksgiving, and I went all over the place. I went to Grand Rapids, Michigan to visit with two of my lovely friends down there and see my best friend from high school who I hadn't seen in 14 years and had just, I came out to him and he said, I can't wait to get to know you all over again. And it was just heartwarming seeing him again. And then I drove down to North Carolina and just, saw people, hung out with my mom. She and I spent Thanksgiving together and just went places. Goodness, I had breakfast with a trans woman that lives there in my hometown, who's a friend, and just kind of reclaimed space. Went to the main street in my hometown and popped into a little boutique and bought some earrings and went up to the town where I lived when I got married and got my nails done and went to the Target in the next county and bought a few things and just kind of. I think that's an important thing. It was for me, and maybe it is for other trans people, like reclaiming space as yourself. To kind of, I think it helps us recontextualize our memories. But anyway, to your question, on my way back up to Canada, I drove through Virginia and stopped in Richmond, Virginia, and I was invited. And I told the pastor of the church I attended in seminary, hey, I'm going to come to church on like November the 28th, 30th, whatever. And he said, well, you should preach for us. And, part of me, I was like, gosh, I'm on vacation. But then the opportunity to like stand as myself in front of this congregation that I'd been a member of from like 2004 to 2007, a place that I really loved, a place that's, there are trans people that are loved and accepted in that church. It was such a cool opportunity. There was an elderly lady who I'd known all those years ago who came up to me as soon as I walked into the sanctuary, and she said, well, first, I think you look gorgeous. Second, I can't imagine the hell you went through to get here. And third, welcome home. And like, I just, I was crying. And after the service, someone walked up to me and, to outward appearances, this would have looked like a man and his wife. And, the quote unquote husband leaned into me and said, my name's Melissa. I just came out to my wife and I can't tell you how much it means to see you up there. And so that was really cool. And that's why I do that. That's why when my pastor friend says, hey, would you go ahead and write and deliver a sermon while you're on vacation? I say, yeah, okay.
That's very beautiful to give that of yourself at that time. I know how much people must appreciate that, to have that example. And a lot of the times as we've seen, the church is one of the biggest advocates against trans and LGBT, just the LGBT community entirely. So that's really beautiful. How have your sermons changed? Like, what is it important? I can see finding that balance of trying to feel like you've got to work something in about being trans and about accepting trans people or LGBT people, and then making it not about that. How has your sermon changed, and how do you find that balance?
That is very perceptive of you, and that is exactly the tightrope that I have to walk. And there are times, if there's one thing that kind of makes me tired about my job, it's that I feel like I'm professionally trans, and I don't necessarily want to do that, and occasionally I've thought, I just want to go get a job where my transness is not centered, and because I'd love to feel like I could move into a phase of my life where my transness is subordinate to my womanhood and not the other way around.
Yeah.
that said, and I would say my clergy colleagues are really good about saying, June, you're not just going to be, we're not going to tokenize you. We're not going to say, okay, June's preaching because it's the Sunday closest to Trans Day of Visibility, and June's preaching because it's closest to Trans Day of Remembrance, and June's going to do this trans thing, and June's going to do that trans thing. So sometimes it's there, and sometimes it's not. The last sermon I preached was about generational trauma. We do a sermon series on some of the films that get nominated for Oscars, and I preached a sermon using Encanto as a kind of thematic framework. And so I didn't say anything about being trans in that sermon, and that was kind of a nice change of pace. But the sermon I'm preaching this Sunday is going to be, it's for Pride Month. It's kind of well, I'm gonna have a brick with me in the pulpit, and I'm gonna be handing out little pieces of brick to everybody at church. And so, I'm gonna be talking about pride as a protest, and how even though we've made really great strides on acceptance and rights for lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, trans people are still under attack, and that type of societal acceptance is really lagging behind. And so in light of that, sometimes it's hard for trans people to stand up and say, I'm really proud of who I am. Like, if you're a trans person in, like Arkansas or Alabama or Texas or Florida, any of those states that's trying to, forcibly detransition trans kids or outlaw gender affirming care, it might be a really tough time to stand up and say, I'm really proud of who I am. And so, I'm reframing pride for myself and maybe for other trans people, not all of us, but as a protest against not only those really influential manifestations of transphobia in the world, but the internalized transphobia that instills in us. Because there's still, I think, an awful lot out in our world that says you should be ashamed of who you are. You should hide who you are. And whether that's very explicit, literally transphobic people saying you're disgusting and you should be ashamed of who you are, or it's a little more, or if it's more like, I'm just really obsessed with passing and I just don't want anybody to know I'm trans, because wouldn't it be horrible if people knew I was trans? If that's where you are, I don't want to, I don't want to condemn you. That's certainly one of my priorities in some ways, but it is kind of interesting how that enters into, it's hard to get rid of shame.
Yeah.
It's hard to get rid of our self-hatred. And I certainly still have a lot of it. So for me, I'm going to be talking about throwing bricks at self-hatred, because it invades your brain just as surely as the cops invaded Compton's cafeteria and Stonewall and the bathhouses here in Toronto. So that sermon's going to be really trans heavy, but they're not all that way. And one of the beautiful things about how my preaching has changed is because of the congregation I'm preaching in. I don't necessarily have to preach a sermon that says, we should be more accepting of LGBTQ people, because it's just where we are.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and it's interesting when you were saying that, one of the things that popped into my head is, I think we're able to get to this point of, not thinking we're horrible. We've got this internalized transphobia and homophobia a lot of times. And we're able to get to a place of acceptance, where it's just like, and we feel that others accept us, and that's what we're hoping for. And not like celebration or not even that, just like not acceptance. I'm sorry, tolerance. Where we tolerate it in ourselves, and we feel that other people can tolerate, but we don't get to a place of truly accepting it ourselves and feeling that we're truly accepted in society. Even to the point of I think kind of subtly and deep down, subconsciously, not believing it's possible.
Yeah.
And that's why I think things that are like that in this sermon are really important to remember. We deserve to be here as much as anybody else.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of us at least make the journey from this is disgusting to this is okay. But then the journey from this is okay to this is awesome. We don't all make that.
Yeah.
And I don't think that I've made that. one of the things I say is like being a woman's awesome. Like having to transition to get to live that way is pretty tough, actually. I don't know if I like that. Uh, just about every day I think to myself, God, I love being a woman. But what I don't think to myself is, wow, being trans is amazing. And so, I freely admit I've got a lot of work to do on myself, and I think I'm doing it pretty faithfully. But it's one of the great things about being in trans community is that, I have a lot of trans siblings who are really good at claiming that sense of like, this is awesome. Being trans is amazing. And even if I hear that and say, I don't know if it is, they at least pull me in that direction. That's kind of, calls back to what I was saying about being around people that make you uncomfortable. Sometimes people really reveling in and celebrating their transness, honest to goodness, it makes me uncomfortable. But I know there's something in me saying, June, you need to grow. Come on, you can do this. And so.
Yeah, that part of you saying you need to grow, fighting against the part that's just like, yeah, I'm not really supposed to be this.
Yeah.
So as we close out here, what is your favorite thing that you've learned through your journey, either about yourself or about the world in general?
Oh, goodness. Well, I've learned that there are a lot of good people out there. Sometimes it's hard to trust. Sometimes because of the trauma I've experienced, because of bad experiences I've had. It's hard for me to accept love. It's hard for me to accept acceptance. It's really difficult when the thing that is your greatest source of shame becomes kind of the center of your identity. You don't just like turn on a dime. And so you spend a lot of your life saying, if people really knew who I was, they would hate me. And then everybody knows who you are and they love you. And you're like, oh, wait a minute, what's wrong with you? Why do you love me? How can you possibly do that? And so the thing I am learning, which I think is the biggest thing, is that even with all the hateful people there are out there, and they're really good at making their voices louder than they deserve to be, there are a lot of good folks out there, and you find your people, and people that'll come and bring you a casserole when you're recovering from surgery, and people that'll write you a check when you're short on your rent, and people that'll take you out to dinner on the day that you're probably going to get fired, and people that will take you away for the weekend on the day that your ex moves out, and those people just showed up. And I think I'm fortunate to have as many people like that in my life as I do, but I think most of us have a few of those folks at least. And I guess the lesson is learning to accept that grace and that love. And it's okay to need grace.
And finally, what advice do you have to pass on to younger closeted trans folks from your experience?
Younger closeted trans folks.
Yeah, young or closeted. Sorry, I might have.
Young or closeted. Oh gosh. Well,
just basically folks who aren't out yet and are looking to go through transition. What advice do you have for them?
Yeah. Just keep doing the next right thing. It is impossible to conceive of where you will be. You will cover so much territory. You will grow so much. You will change so much. Like the place that your mind and conception is right now can't get there. And that's okay. This is not the kind of process where you have a roadmap that says, here's your destination and here's where you're going to get, here's when you're going to get there and here's what it's going to look like. But I can tell you, it's going to be better than you can imagine. And so just do the next thing. If it's calling an electrologist, or if it's talking to your doctor, or if it's putting on nail polish, or if it's, telling that one person in your life, you know what, my pronouns are she, her. Like, just do that thing. And the next thing will get a little easier, and the next thing will get a little easier. Or maybe it won't be easier, but you'll do it. And before long, you just do that one step, one step, one step, one foot in front of the other, and you'll travel so far. You'll look back and you just won't believe it. Just take the next step, one foot in front of the other.
Wonderful advice. Junia Joplin, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing so much of your story with our audience.
Thanks for having me, Emily. It's been a real pleasure.